Good evening and welcome to this LSE public lecture hosted by the Department of Economic History at the London School of Economics. Our speaker this evening is Professor Jan Lucassen, who will be talking about the story of work, a new history of humankind, based on his recent book published by Yale University Press, which I'm sure we'll get quite a good number of plugs for. I certainly hope so. My name is Patrick Wallis. I'm a professor in the Department of Economic History and the current head of department. The department is one of the largest and most active centers for research and teaching in economic history in the world today. And because of this, work has always been central to the questions that we ask about the economic past. Work is also obviously ever more central, or increasingly central, to a series of political and economic debates about the world today and where it's going in the future. As I'm sure you're aware, we're experiencing a massive shock to work. Welcome to what has become my office. We're also in a period where technological change is raising questions about the location and organization of different kinds of labor, with a huge amount of uncertainty about how artificial intelligence, for example, might change how we live and work in years to come. So our old assumptions about supervision and management, about careers and the role of hard work and identity have all been under pressure, open for debate, shall we say. Coronavirus is not the first shock. Artificial intelligence is not the first technological change that have affected the nature of work, the delivery of work in fundamental ways. And there can be no one better to tell us about how these fit into the long history of work than Jan Lucassen. Jan is an emeritus professor at the Free University of Amsterdam and former director of the International Institute for Social History. He's written extensively about global labor history in a whole range of places and regions of the world. Just looking at what he's done recently, it covers everything from India to the Ottoman Empire and Europe. So this book, the book he's talking about today, is in some ways the culmination of decades of scholarship turned into, I think, what's an incredibly engaging book that opens this up to a wide readership. So Jan, welcome to LSE. We look forward to hearing what you have to tell us this evening. And let me hand over the mic over to you and invite you to start your lecture. Thank you. Zoom is obviously one of those technologies that I was just talking about that have shocked work. So Jan.
Hello, hello Patrick, and welcome everybody. You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Yeah, it's. I'd love to come to London from Gouda, where I'm living in the Netherlands, but unfortunately we have to do it this way, and I'll do my best to make it a lively presentation about indeed my book, The Story of Work, A New History of Humankind. It's a rather fat book, I must confess. So how to present it in a short period, and nu moet je even kijken of die gaat weer niet te laag. I'm looking for the how to switch the.
If you maybe just click with your right keypad, right arrow, that might do it.
Zij zien het wel hoor. Zij zien het wel.
Oh yeah, you see, yeah. Now you see, yeah, that's what I want. Sorry. So I've chosen to break it into three. First, I'll talk about my approach, because how, and that has been, of course, a big challenge for myself too, how to organize the history of work of the world for the entire human history. So I'll talk about concepts that I've chosen: space, time, interdisciplinary approach, and also the way I've chosen to present my results. So that's the first half of the presentation. Then there will be a story in 7 league boots. So from the beginning until now, which of course will be very superficial, but at least it will give you an impression of what the book is about. And then I want to go back to the starting point and to say something about the essence of work as I see it. So first about my approach and about the concepts, because I had to define for myself, of course, what do I mean by work? Which type of human activity can be considered to be work? Which should be included? Which should not be included? And also talking about human beings performing work and defending their interests. How do they do it? Then about space, it will be about, well, the choice, what the implications of the choice to write a global history, and which is, of course, can be contrasted to what normally happens in labor history, which is rather Eurocentric or maybe Atlantocentric. Then about the time frame, and then about interdisciplinarity, because when you write labor history for the last few centuries, of course, you can depend on written sources, but if you start 700,000 years ago, you cannot, and you need to use the evidence from archaeology, prehistory, anthropology, paleogenetics, and paleolinguistics. And of course, I had to make some choices how to present the results of my research for a wider audience, because of course, I want to serve my peers and everybody in economic history and social history and labor history, but my pretension is to go beyond that, because in the end, and that's an advantage of this topic, we all work or have worked or know people who have worked. We can compare our own work with that of our parents, of our grandparents. So in a way, we are all experts. And then addressing experts in a serious way, I had to choose how to do it. And I've chosen for a chronological narrative. Although there are academic discussions to be found in a preliminary note and also in the annotation. But the book has not been organized in a way that I say, Professor A says this, Professor B says that, and I think, etc., etc. That's not the way I've chosen to organize the stuff. Well, the first set of concepts has to do with work. What is included and what is not. And I think this photograph tells it all. This woman is at work. She's not being paid, but she definitely here in Amsterdam around 1950, she is at work. So I've chosen to have an inclusive definition of work. And if we define very simply labor relations as the relations we entertain with other people while working, work in the household is at the center of labor relations, according to me, and I'll talk more about that later. There are several discussions about what work is, but I've chosen one definition by the American sociologists, son Chris and father Charles Tilley, Chuck Tilley, who said in 1998, work includes any human effort adding use value to goods and services. And you may read the rest of the definition, but I'd like to read out the second part because I think that's very essential and a very concise formula of what is at stake. Only a prejudice bred by Western capitalism and its industrial labor markets fixes on strenuous effort expended for money payment outside the house as real work, relegating other efforts to amusement, crime, and mere housekeeping. Mere housekeeping, as you see again on this enigmatic photograph from Amsterdam. That means that the work within the household, which I call reciprocal work, and you see it at the bottom of this figure, the first figure in my book. Reciprocity starts from the beginning of our human history, and it goes on up until now. And the Tillies even estimate that most work done in the world is still reciprocal labor within the household. The figure also shows not only the time frame from 700,000 years ago, but also how I've distributed this over the chapters. And then you see that the second type of labor relation that I distinguish in chapter 2 and chapter 3 and up until now is independent production, first and foremost of peasants, and then come artisans and all kind of other entrepreneurial work without using wage labor. Because if you do, then you are of course an employer, and employers also work, by the way. But the earliest employers you find are those that employ slaves, and that precedes very much the emergence of labor markets. As you can see here, according to my estimation, it started some 3,000 years BCE. And then you have something which sounds a bit complicated, tributary redistribution, but I'll explain that later, which is the form in which the surpluses of work were redistributed before there were markets. And that's a very important, at least for me, it was also a very important discovery in a way, that is part and parcel of the history of work. So far, very briefly about the central concepts that I've chosen. So my definition of work and a kind of taxonomy of labor relations. And here you see prevailing labor relations during our human history. And you see also that they don't exclude each other. They can coincide. And at this very moment, we see that the most important labor relations are reciprocity within the household, then employer-employee relationships, and independent production. A second set of concepts have to do with what I call working strategies. These are strategies, attempts to maintain or improve working conditions. And that pertains both to independent producers and to wage workers, and even to unfree laborers. And for me, the most important distinction is between, on the one hand, individual and household strategies, which in the conventional labor history do not receive enough attention, I think, and that is geographic mobility or migration and social mobility. And what I mean is that most people who do not like the situation they are in or who fear a deterioration do not immediately try to organize other sufferers and start collective action. No, they take private action. They try to be good mates with the boss, or they try to find another boss, or to migrate, or whatever. And I think that is much, much more important than what, well, I might say that the majority of labor history is concerned with, that is collective action. So that is the second one. I'm not saying, emphatically, I'm not saying that this is unimportant or that the one is more important than the other. I'm only saying that there is much more there when we talk about the agency of workers, as it sometimes is called, that there is also much more than collective action. However, as I say, collective action was important, is still very important, and it has, and that should be underlined, it has a long history, much longer than what you see on the right slide, the classical trade unions, but also what you see on the left-hand side, the guilds, and this is a guild procession in Istanbul in 1597, if I'm not mistaken. And here you see the tailors, a procession of the tailors parading before the Sultan. So these are my main conceptual choices that I've made. And now, as to the space, I've tried a global approach. One example here is I've done my best to include Indian history, which also has the advantage that you also can talk about caste as one way of organizing work, as caste is includes hereditary work, specific types of work within a certain group. Another example is labor in Japan, but I could have made many more slides, of course, South America, Africa, etc. I've tried systematically for each development that I found in one part of the world to see whether I could find similar or totally different developments in other parts of the world. So it means that there is not that I've tried to evade the trap. Of course, I don't know whether I've been successful, but to try to evade the trap that I say, well, there is one rule, that's the development of Europe, and then let's see whether the others follow the rule, yes or no. And so that I've tried to avoid that and to see to really take a global approach, which, by the way, meant, of course, that I had to read a lot about China and about Japan, about which I knew nothing, let alone about the Mayas and the Aztecs, etc., etc. Anyway, then the time frame. If we start from the beginning of what is considered now to be the human history, 700,000 years ago, the implication is that 98% of this history of human work consists of hunting, gathering, and preparing food. And I suggest, and I think that this has very important implications about how we consider work and what we think about remuneration of work. It is hardly conceivable, I think, that if this is nearly our total history, that this does not have implications for what happened later on. And what I see as the characteristics of work as organized among hunter-gatherers, and of course there I have to depend on what, on the one hand, primatologists, and on the other hand, especially anthropologists say. So the anthropological analogy, that the main characteristics are that work is organized in small units of a handful or maybe a few dozen households at the maximum, who work closely together, including childcare, and mind you, as household work is at the center of the definition, that should be also should be taken seriously. But also because within such small groups, social control is feasible. It means that you can distribute the gains on an egalitarian basis, balancing efforts and remuneration. You know exactly who is doing his or her best and who is not. It's not that you are going to, at least that's what the anthropologists say, it's not that you're going to starve somebody, the lazy ones, but they do not get as much as others. But efforts are being remunerated. Well, then here you see an example of this long time history and what I had to talk about. This is the spread of modern humans over the world, from Africa to the other parts of the world, just as an example. And also for myself, because sometimes it's mind-boggling the period you are talking about and the space you are talking about. So I've drawn a few models where I try to combine space and time. Space you can see on the left-hand side, and down there is the time axis, but also interdisciplinarity, because you see there evidence as language, paleogenetics, cave paintings, Venus figurines, the change of skin color, and so on and so forth. So I needed to draw such figures for myself, but I hope they are also helpful for the readers. Here's another one for a somewhat later period, between 5000 BCE, where you see how in different parts of Eurasia civilizations developed when mining was, so to say, invented, when we see the first enslavements, when we see corvée labor, and so on. Then finally, as I said, I had to make thoughts about how to present all this. And I've chosen, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, not to render the many discussions that are going on among the specialists as such, but to make a choice, a deliberate choice of what I think is the most likely outcome for the time being, of course, because mind you, if you go to paleogenetics, for instance, David Reich, who is one of the main authors in this field, he writes simply in his introduction, he says, the moment you, dear reader, are reading this, much of what I'm writing now may be outdated already. So it goes very quickly. That's not the case, I fear, in 19th, 20th century history, but in those fields it is. So I know there are discussions, and in a note in the beginning of the book, I say something about it, how I've made choices, but for the rest, for the specialists, I hope they can find in my extensive annotation what I've done, and they can follow this. Having said this, if you write a narrative for not only, of course, I write for my peers, as I said, but not only for my peers, but also for a wider audience who might be interesting, which might be interesting in the history of work, then I've chosen to bring up as many working people as possible by citing them. And one of the most impressive, to my mind, testimonies is this one by a man who in the 1920s talked about his life, and which has been recorded in his speech, emphatically in his speech. And here, this man recalls how he was enslaved, and finally how he was sold to Americans and taken to America. And I hope by presenting working people in their own language as far as possible to enhance the understanding of the history of work. So that's the first part of my presentation. And now I come to the second part, which is about hunter-gatherers and reciprocity. I've said something about it already, how hunter-gatherers became farmers, how farmers under certain circumstances could produce surpluses, what happened with these surpluses, and there are several possibilities. One of the outcomes was state formation, first city formation and then state formation, and state formation leading nearly unavoidably, I fear, to slavery and enslavement. And then rather late in history, at least if you take history as long as I do, rather late in history, the emergence of markets, including labor markets, and the role of monetization for the development of wage labor. Having said that, when you have markets and you have wage labor, it is very clear that the outcome is not then, automatic outcome is not that enslavement and slave labor vanishes, not at all. You may have free and unfree labor for the market next to each other, sometimes in different polities, sometimes in the same polity. Then from, let's say, 1500, so maybe a little bit more familiar to most of the people who might listen to me tonight, is the globalization of labor relations after 1500 and the emergence of what is called the industrious revolution, preceding for a couple of centuries what is more common knowledge, the industrial revolution, and finally some words about automation and robotization. So that's the program for the second part of my talk. The oldest form of division of labor, and again, I have to remind you that the household work is at the center of my story, is what has been called alloparenting. It means sharing the care of babies and small infants, that the mother, who is here at the center of this photograph from Peru around 1960, that the mother is prepared to sharing the care of her babies with what you can see here, her mother or her mother-in-law. Of course, we do not know who she is, but that's, so it's over several generations. And you might say, well, what does it mean? But if we compare ourselves with our intimate neighbors, the apes, they do not do this. This is very important. This is a very important step which frees the mother for part of her time for other activities. And also what the theoreticians now think, that it also enhances the stability of a couple. So it's not like under many primates where you have groups of females and babies, and let's say the males around it looking for their chances. No, this is the household formation is basic to human history, and also, I think, to the history of work. Another feature of hunting gathering is that it is cooperative work. On this engravement from Australia around 1800, you see right down there, you see a brave hunter. And that's, of course, how we envisage always hunters. There is a superior human being killing an animal. But what you should see also is all the people around and making fires. So it's really a cooperative work here to be able to slaughter a few kangaroos and then to divide the meat among the group. Now we make a big jump, and then we go from hunting, gathering to agriculture. What's interesting is here, and we'll see it also again when we'll talk about deep monetization, is that important, let's say, innovations in food management, so the management of plants, but also of animals, has taken place independently in different parts of the world. So there is not as we tend to think, well, let's say electricity, there's one clever guy in the world who finds out how to use it, and then others emulate it. So here you see many clever boys and girls inventing millet or guinea, or how to tame guinea fowl, or how to plant potatoes, or how to use turkeys, etc., all over the world in different periods. At the same time, you also see combinations, of course. For instance, rice from China traveling to India, and the zebu traveling from Mesopotamia to India, and that kind of combinations. But what I want to stress here, that, and that's of, I think, also an important achievement of global history, is that you see a much more equal division of human achievements all over the globe, except for that, as contrasting to that it all comes from one center, and certainly from Europe. As I said, when you have agriculture, there is a possibility that under favorable circumstances, and in Egypt they were possibly, but also Mesopotamia, they were very favorable, that you have surpluses. And what is the importance of surpluses? That you can feed people who do not produce agricultural production. So it means labor specialization, that you have artisans, for instance, who make furniture, or smiths, weavers, spinners, and so on. They can devote all their activity to non-agricultural work. And this is possible because agriculturalists, so peasants, produce more than they need to feed themselves. The big issue, of course, is how does the produce of the peasants come to the specialists, and how come the produce of the specialists come to the peasants? That in a very simple village farm model, like which is known for India, that might be simple. But when you have, and that happens slightly later, when you have cities and later on states, the redistribution of the agricultural produce and the redistribution of the produce of the non-agriculturalists is really a problem, which can be solved in quite a few ways. One of the ways which I describe in my book and which I see in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in northern India and in China is that you have cities or city-states where there is a central redistribution organized around a temple. So the idea or the ideology, you might say, is that we all produce for the gods, they collect it in the temple, and they redistribute it. And of course, it means that a priest caste does it. Yeah, that is an important feature because it means distribution of products without markets. And this can involve inequality between members of a society, and that has been emphasized in much or most of the literature. But recently we have very nice evidence from Africa that that is not necessary. There you see a big gap between the agricultural revolution on the one hand and the emergence of inequality thousands and thousands of years later on the other. So there's no automatic link, as often suggested, between agricultural surpluses and inequality. That is not necessary. The redistribution, as I showed on the map, you see in several parts of Eurasia, but I think that the so-called pre-Columbian civilizations in America, they developed the same or similar systems. So it is quite a universal one way of organizing a complicated civilization without markets. As I said, states, and we saw the emergence of states some 4,000 years ago, first in Mesopotamia, implicate warfare. And what do you do after you have won a war? What you do with the women, unfortunately, is very clear. But what you do with the man, that is there you have the option. There is a lot of evidence where you see that you kill the man you have conquered, either because of the ideologies that they don't deserve to live any longer. But what you see very quickly is another solution. You enslave them. And that is what you see on the left-hand side in Akkad, in Mesopotamia, and of course the most well-known example of slave work is the gladiators in the Roman Empire, the Greek civilization in the Roman Empire. And again, slaves and slave labor precedes thousands of years the market economy. Then another jump to 2,500 years ago, when you see what I call deep monetization. Deep monetization is not necessarily the introduction introduction of coins, but especially it is the introduction and production and distribution of small coins. And there is no logic, as sometimes suggested, that you do this because it enhances and facilitates trade. There is no point in buying an ox for 200 or 300 small coppers. Then you can do that differently. So the story that the exchange between oxen and sheep became too complicated, and then they invented coins. I think that is not the main story. The main story is that societies became emerged a demand for means of exchange because they were needed. And what is interesting here, and there is a parallel to the Neolithic revolution, that this happened at the same time in different parts of the world. In this case, in the Eastern Mediterranean on the left, China in the middle, and Northern India on the right-hand side. And this, I suggest, is on the one hand, this innovation is triggered by wage payments, but it also facilitates and enables wage payments. And I use the numismatic evidence, as it's called, the evidence, archaeological evidence of coin finds, especially for parts of the world where we have no or hardly any written evidence. So I use this as a fossil guide for wage labor, the emergence and also the disappearance of wage labor, because that happens too. So then we come to what I said, next to each other, commercial agriculture with wage laborers, as you see here in the late Middle Age, medieval Europe, and with unfree laborers, as you see here in 17th century Suriname. And then the so-called industrious revolution. What we mean is the following. It is a term coined by Jan de Vries from California. What we mean is an intrinsic problem of peasants. Peasants have to work very hard in summer in our part of the world, and in winter you have hardly anything to do. And the innovation simply is that peasants start doing different things, start weaving, spinning, making nails, making wooden furniture, and so on and so forth. And this you see from around 1500, at the same time in China, Japan, Europe, to a certain extent also in India. And that is called the Industrious Revolution, which for the history of work is as important, I think, as the famous Industrial Revolution, where we go from muscle power to steam power. I don't have to say too much about that. The outcome of it is that an increasing part of the population is engaged in wage labor, and especially in wage labor outside the household. That is crucial. And then I talked before about social control, about who is lazy and who is doing his best. This problem, of course, arises very prominently in factories. And there you see, and there I refer again to the Tillies, there you see several ways of enhancing productivity, which is not only wage payments, but also what you see on the left-hand side, all kind of medals and non-pecuniary remuneration, but of course also force. So there are three types of labor motivation, and we see them up until now. It's always a mix between the three of them, and think of your own situation and you can easily find that they all apply. Finally, automation and robotization, which I had to discuss and which I discuss at the end of the book, and especially the many predictions that we have had since Jules Verne in the 1870s, that within, let's say, 20 or 50 or whatever years, work would stop and we all wouldn't know what to do with our leisure time. What I think is that these predictions are not only always wrong, but it's also very unlikely, and that there is a lot of evidence in modern history that, to the contrary, we are working more and more and harder, whatever these predictions say. Come to my conclusion. I want to go back to the starting point and the definition of work of the Tillys. And I think they've proven to be very frugal for my book, for writing my book. They've been an inspiration from the beginning until the end. Yet, at the end, I thought there is more to it than the very useful delimitations they propose. And I come to three conclusions. First, work provides us a living, and that's of course what you see in their definition very clearly, but it provides us with much more. It also provides us with self-respect and with meaning, because we, and think about it yourself, we derive much of our respect, or if not all of our self-respect, from the respect of others, and others respect us because of our achievements, which are mainly in work. Might be also a nice car and so on, but in the end, it's our work. And this self-respect provides us with meaning. So that's also why I think that the history of work is so central to history at large. Work, secondly, is not an individual activity. Of course, technically it's an individual activity, but in reality, none of us, or hardly any of us, work on our own. We work with others. And that's not only vertically, as often emphasized in labor history. So it is the relation between the boss and the worker and so on, but also horizontally. We work with others, and their opinions and their attitude matters maybe as much or more than the relation with the boss. Finally, while working, we aim at a fair remuneration according to our efforts. And I think that reminds us to the 98% of our history as described before. Well, that is the way I've tried to summarize my book, and I hope it's a bit clear and it can elicit some questions or some comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. That's extremely illuminating and very interesting. Enormously ambitious as well. And congratulations also on the first animated title page that I, for one, have ever seen, which is a fantastic piece of art as well. We are going to have some time for questions in a few minutes, but before we open the floor, I'm very pleased that we're joined by Professor Sara Horrell. Sara is one of the professors in the Department of Economic History. Sara's been working for a long time on work, on wages, on the family economy, and these different aspects of work that relate very much to the way in which you've been discussing, although her own work is not over, I think, 700,000 years, but more over the last few centuries, particularly the 19th century. So Sara, let me hand over to you for a commentary on Jan's book from a different
Thank you,
perspective.
Patrick. Yes, thank you. Let me just, sorry, there we go. Oh. Right. Yes. Jan, a fantastic book. I mean, it's the coverage is just huge. It's immense. The scope and reach is just amazing, and the amount of material you marshal here, is fantastic. You've taken us on a journey from earliest times, the hunter-gatherers, to nascent specializing in monetized cities, right up to current day concerns about the future of work. And I suspect that's something that people will want to talk about quite a bit in the discussion. As you've shown us, the experience is worldwide, and you've covered a huge diversity of arrangement of the forms of work there. So what are the key messages? I think you actually articulated that in that last slide there, and I've sort of reiterating it here because it forms part of where I want to go with the discussion. one of the things I think that does come out of the book is that there's nothing predetermined about the direction in which forms of work are going to take over time. That it happens. I mean, there may be features that determine where it all goes, but there's no straightforward linear path, I think is how I put it. The other, as you point out, is that humans are basically social and cooperative beings who follows these principles of reciprocity and fairness in thinking about the returns to our labour. And these are both really optimistic things when we think about how to negotiate the future and the challenges of the future, things like artificial intelligence, because it does mean that, in your view, we've got plenty to think about and plenty of positive ways of actually thinking about how we negotiate this future. I quote here from you in page 14 here, the universal appeal of fairness seems to be prevailing now, and seeing this as the way we want to go forward. So what is there left to ask about this? And I feel there's three areas for further discussion that would be really interesting to think a bit more about. One is how this social history fits or contradicts the nature of work as understood in economic analysis, because I think your work actually presents quite a strong challenge to an economic view of work. I'd also like to look more at gender and women's experience of work, and just very briefly at the end, think a little bit, or at least ask you about how the relationship between the form work takes and economic growth. But let's start with economics. And just to sort of recap something we all know, the guiding principles in economics here is that you have an individual who's maximizing their own well-being, who is optimizing within constraints and is essentially doing the best for themselves that they can. But within that model, the benefit of work is essentially material consumption, and the cost is reduced leisure, it's time versus goods. And whilst individuals might differ, we find the main drivers of this, at least in market economies, are economic variables, wages and unearned income. Of course, this can be extended, and economists have extended it to encompass other forms of work, things like slavery, second serfdom that you talk about in the book. So it's not just purely a market analysis here. And people like Gary Becker, of course, cover it to cover household work and various forms of household labour too. So how's your work? Well, your work, I think, is very much challenging this notion of rational economic men, and on two main fronts. That, as you said at the end there, rather than having disutility, work very much has a positive value to us, that we measure our own worth through work, through our social interactions in the workplace, and this all gives meaning to our lives. And the other, I think, although you didn't explicitly say this, is that we're not selfish utility maximizing individuals. Instead, we are cooperative and will work more collectively, and particularly collectively to operationalize our underlying notions of fair returns to labour, collective action there. Again, I quote, the principle of reciprocity is at the basis of human work relations. Now, I must say, I actually agree with you on the first one. I actually do think work definitely has a positive value. And if you, I mean, as people have done, look at surveys, for instance, of the unemployed and really analyse how they feel about their position, it is clear that work does have meaning and positive value. I'm less convinced, though, about the being cooperative and not selfish. And as I understood in the book, your argument in part is that the settled farming practices yield surpluses, as you point out in the presentation. These are collected and redistributed in these tributary redistributive societies. And you have what you describe in the book as aggrandizers that oversee the process. But there's relatively little, I think, said about the people that are the aggrandizers. And I know in the presentation, you said, in Africa, you're not seeing people actually benefiting or individually benefiting from this. And so it's not necessarily the case. But in a lot of the world, I think you are seeing that people set themselves above others. The aggrandizers are, in some sense, capturing more of this surplus than maybe they're due. And you don't really sort of mention, what type of people are these? And I think if we're honest, and maybe I reveal too much about myself here, but very few of us would opt to be the common labourer, the peasant, over the aggrandizer, the person that's the chief, the king, the priest that's overseeing this, controlling the people, able to allocate the surplus. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is I think in terms of the actions you see, that you're seeing the selfish utility maximizing individual alive and well in this account, that cooperation may be, well, as I say, your work presents this real challenge to economic interpretations of motivations work and individual motivation. And I'd like, be interested in the discussion as to where this really leads us. Similarly, with industrial action, you talk about collective action, you talk about individuals acting together to achieve fairness, to go on strike and things, to articulate their notions of fairness here. But there's a lot of evidence, both historically and in sort of economic work and so on, that collective action gains often act to the detriment of outsiders, the people that are unskilled, women, religious and ethnic minorities. And so again, I suppose I'm wondering how far our notions of reciprocity and fairness actually stretch. I mean, is it just something that applies to our own group that we identify with, or is it something that we see for humankind more generally? So that's my first thing, is wanting to actually think a bit more about really motivations for work and how individuals operate. The second is gender. And as you said at the beginning, your productive work's basically defined as all human pursuits apart from free time or leisure, with non-work obligations also being distinct from leisure. So engaging in networks, social relations and so on is a part of work. And it's clear, and you're clear about this too, that then women are constituting at least half of the world's labour throughout history. Yet women's experience, explicit experience, is referred to on just 4 occasions through the book. And I'm afraid I'm a bit of a nerd here. I counted up the pages. And I have to say, for a book that's subtitled A New History of Humankind, it does seem to me to be a bit of an omission to devote just 2% of the content to womankind. Now, actually, you might say to me, well, does this matter? If women's experience is the same as men's, or if all humans have the same experience, then you maybe don't need to explicitly look at women. But I'm going to suggest, and this is what I want to sort of bring out a little bit in the discussion, is what perspective does this miss? Is it missing a perspective by not looking at women explicitly? And so I've got a few pointers. I mean, there's obviously a lot that could be said on this, but there's just a few aspects I want to try and pull out in this discussion. I think my interpretation of what you're saying in the book, at least, is you're saying early on women's position arises from their need to look after children and their responsibilities for childbearing and child rearing, and that in settled agricultural societies, this means that they're tied close to the home, that farming becomes their activity while the men can go off and hunt their kangaroos. And yet, of course, this is a form of biological determinism, really, isn't it? That's been very much sort of argued against by many authors from many different perspectives. You see women as being valued in the society. I think you point up that bride price becomes paid in settled agricultural societies, and see this as being part of this value and maybe even sort of reciprocity of some form. But I think you could interpret this in a different way as well. I mean, you could see it as being that women are effectively owned by men, and that this ownership is patrilocal. They're effectively sold by their fathers to their husbands. They move from their fathers' places to their husbands' places. And so I suppose I'm suggesting that looking at women as a separate type of experience is important if you think that patriarchy is a factor in terms of women's experience of their position in work as defined by you and the type of labours that they do. You do comment that guilds tend to exclude women, that collective action can actually be excluding women. You don't, for me, I'd want more discussion of how economic and other factors play into this. I'm sort of thinking of like the 15th century decline in trade and the economic retraction, which sort of promote this removal of unfair competition. But also within that discussion, it'd be worth knowing why women are seen as particularly problematic in terms of the competition they present. But it's not just about response to sort of economic pressures, I think, because women are not just excluded from trades in this period, or at least in Northern Europe and certainly in England. They're prevented from taking on education, they're not allowed to own property, or at least married women aren't. And so there's various aspects of life, social life, community life, that women become excluded from. And so they do end up, at least in this argument, labouring in domestic responsibilities. And so what I'm really saying is doesn't this actually present a slightly different story about not just reciprocity, but women actually being in certain positions because of lack of outside options, that we can't see this as exercising of choice, but there's a lack of options available to them. As you mentioned, women do come into the labour market in the industrious and industrial revolutions, but they're also returned to the home after both these phases to some extent. And certainly in many accounts, collective action by men is complicit in this returning women to the home. We find obviously trade unions as development in the 19th century, demands for a family wage over many places and things, pushing women back into the home. We also see them drawn in and out in various cycles subsequently. So for instance, in wars and when there's labour shortages, women enter the labour market, as you point out in the book. When there's high unemployment, when there's the espousing of family values, they tend to be pushed back into the home. So a Marxist interpretation of this would be that women actually really have been constituting a reserve army of labour that serves the needs of the capitalist economy, that they're being pushed around or pulled around by the needs of the economy, and that it isn't really their notion of self-worth or self-esteem or what they gain from work that's governing labour force participation. In the book, you state that women shared in the gains that the labour movement have achieved in constraining what I'm describing here as the exploitation by capital, and that this has given them greater gender equality. But I'm sort of wondering whether you couldn't also argue that greater gender equality has resulted from women's fight against men rather than from men's fight against capital. So I really would welcome in the discussion a much more sort of thought about whether we don't need some separate experience of women to flesh out in some senses or some aspects this story of work. And finally, just briefly, the relationship of work to the wider economy. And I think we're both agreed that you know what you've shown in the book very clearly is there is nothing deterministic about the direction in which work develops. But I do wonder whether you're not in the book quite often showing that economic change comes first, and that is the impetus to the form of work, a change in the form of work. And then we maybe need to think about what causes the economic change. And I suppose I'm again sort of starting, harping on about motivations, what motivates individuals. I mean, if it is sort of, what causes exploration and experimentation and invention, and if it's personal gain, if it's ideas of some form of, I put in inverted commas, greed, but gain, personal gain, then does that challenge the ideas of reciprocity and cooperation being at the root of sort of human nature in a way? And I also want to ask whether there's geographic and economic patterns that determine the form of work adopted. You sort of mentioned this when we talk about, when you were talking about slavery and the second serfdom, and indeed types of marriage patterns and moves to pastoral agriculture, that there are certain sort of geographic and economic conditions that favour the emergence of these. And I'm wondering if whether seeing patterns in this can actually help us come back to that earlier question about the options we have for determining the future of work. Can we actually maybe see something a bit more predictable about where we go and what options are available to us? There's been a huge amount in this book. There's absolutely loads to discuss, and I look forward to us all doing this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was incredibly rich discussion with lots and lots of points for Jan to be thinking about, and probably a long cup of coffee for that one, right? To consider all of those different things. I think it's quite important that we actually get a chance for our audience to ask questions, and we have got an extraordinary number of questions in the Q&A. And as I think you'll have seen among the audience, that you can upvote. So we're seeing a number of different questions getting quite a lot of traction. And I'm interested perhaps to put one of the two of these to Jan now, if you wouldn't mind. So Jan, one question that I think is very prominent here in different forms is really what I was thinking of as the kind of Keynes question, right? You know, as he who puts it, the idea used to be that if we got richer and we automated more work, we could work less. And instead of that, we end up working more. And so I think the question is really, do you see any prospect for breaking this cycle? And I suppose you might add to that, do you think we should be looking to break the cycle, given how you connect work and identity and respect? So let me put you that particular question about the future, which is obviously not your area of expertise as a historian, but let's ask you.
Exactly, I'm a historian. But first, before reacting to you, I'd like to thank Sara very, very much for this rich comment. Really, well, we should discuss it at length, but these are exactly great points. And but anyway, so to your question, I think if we go to the present and let's say the last few decades, why are people, especially in this part of the world, we should stress that, are working harder than making at least more hours, especially if you define it per household. Let's say man and woman together in a classic household, they are making more working hours these days than their parents used to do a few decades ago. I think it has to do with their desire, and a very understandable desire, to maintain at least the same level of prosperity as their parents had. But it also has to do with, I think, the expectations in which we all have grown up, the expectation of improvement over the generations. And that is something which is what seems to be stopping now, at least for a lot of people. And at least what people try to achieve is not to fall back. So I think these are the two motivations why people work so hard. Well, to, let's say, to maintain the position and to maintain the hope that somehow they can improve. So they share the same, I think, values as their parents and maybe their grandparents do. But this is what they have to do to achieve this.
So do you think that this value of improvement, this hope for improvement, is in some ways a little bit in tension with the idea of work as a fundamental source of respect and identity? And that one is satisfying, one is advancing.
Yep, I think that is definitely so, because you also might say this the emphasis that I put on respect, self-respect, etc. You also might say that's a trap. If we are so much dependent on it, we have to do so much for it. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. I'm going to bring in, I'm going to merge a couple of questions here, which have been very popular about technology. I mean, it's very striking in the story that you've told us that technology is really fundamental to many of the changes, the steps in work. And I think that several people, I'm looking at Hugh James's question, Rebecca Magor's question, are really interested in how technology might change work now. AI, I mean, this changes, or this is clearly encroaching, I think, as Hugh puts it, on how individuals relate to each other in work. The migration to remote working is changing how we work together. I think the question is, on the one hand, do you see the current set of technological changes people are experiencing as significant changes to work of the scale that perhaps you've been discussing in your book? And do you think that there will need to be a set of changes to respond to them in how work is organized and how we fit work into our life?
It certainly does, continuously. But we should not equate this with diminishing work. That is something totally different. So it changes continuously, and I think the great challenge is to how to maintain a certain degree of autonomy in our work. That's basic. That's basic now, but it also will be basic in the face of artificial intelligence and automation. And there we come to maybe a point that Sara raised about, let's say, selfishness, but you also might say it's ambition, ambition to improve ourselves. That is, I hope I'm not denying this in my book, and I'm certainly not denying it as such. I think this is basic to human beings. Human beings are have initiative, want to improve, and you also might call that selfish. The only problem is, of course, that they cannot do it on their own as an individual, against economic theory, the presuppositions of economic theory. We cannot, so they have to do it within a group. The smallest group is the household. And then what kind of possibilities do they have? It depends on their gender, and also outside. So, and that also is the question, because that is part and parcel of our human nature. I mean, cooperation is part and parcel of our human nature, but initiative and selfishness is as well. They don't exclude each other, I think. So, and if let's say the positive side is it a certain degree of autonomy, which is very important for self-respect, but also the satisfaction of doing something in the way you think you can do it best. What is the challenge of this in the face of artificial intelligence and so on? And there is, I think, a very big challenge. If you think about certain images we know from China, where Big Brother is really watching you and correcting you, and so on. At least that's what I privately think. But again, I'm a historian. I'm not a futurologist. But yeah.
So, I mean, let me bring in, I guess, the second part of this question about how these things might change, and that is, I think, about whether or not something like a universal basic income might become necessary, and whether you'd think that was desirable in this kind of context, given what I think you're telling us here, which is quite an optimistic story about work as a source of identity and as a focus for human ambition, for striving, a way to find ourselves, right? And in that kind of world, the world that we're entering, would you be an advocate for a UBI? Would you think that was a useful solution to the problem of work?
I'm very hesitant about this because on the one hand, of course, I want everybody to have a decent living. Why should I have that right, and why should others not? There is no moral argument conceivable for this, even for the most lazy of my co-humans. I want to have a good minimum. Why am I hesitant? Exactly because of what we were just discussing. The risk of taking away initiative, the risk of taking away autonomy. And I don't have a solution for it. I I quote several interesting studies on Britain, which have done on this, which have been done on this point. I think if we are talking about social challenges, this is one of the main ones. In a way, of course, we have already kind of mixed system. Nobody, well, hardly anybody is. It's not necessary to die in the streets as it used to happen in many big cities in India until recently. There's no need. So we have a kind of welfare state, a very minimal welfare state in a lot of countries. But extending, to what extent you can extend it at the cost of taking away initiative and autonomy, that's the big question.
Thank you. It's a very, very interesting debate. I think that's one we're going to come back to again and again. I'm going to stop asking you about the future, but I am going to raise a question that has been put in a couple of different ways in the questions. I suppose it's really around, again, people asking about the optimism that I think comes out in your view of this. Richard Stevens frames it like this. How can you talk about the universal appeal of fairness when he would suggest that's the last thing that's happened in history in the world of work, and certainly today, because effort does not match reward? And I think we see this in another question by Elke Ranola, commenting that the hardest workers are the lowest paid. So, I mean, how would you see that kind of critique? I think it's one that's very common today. We think about payment for social care and so on, in the context of the framework that you're setting out here, where you give us a sense perhaps of a more optimistic view of work, reward, fairness.
I don't deny what these people say, but I'm saying that this is what we are striving at. That is very different of what reality is. Or to put it in a negative way, it is, I think, historical evidence does not show that if you have long enough such an incongruent relation between efforts and remuneration, that we think, well, in the end, okay, that's how it has to be. No, that's not. That is not our nature. And we also should take a historical view that although there is so much rotten in our state, if you talk about this, that it is in many respects a big improvement of what we have seen 100 and 150 years ago. And this does not only go for Europe or the North Atlantic, but especially also goes for China. If you see there the improvements, they are so immense over the last decades. I'm not advocating China as the most ideal society. To the contrary, but this is what we also should see. I mean, we should try to avoid a too narrow view of the deterioration that we see in our own society here in the West, which I cannot deny and which I also describe in the book and which I deplore. But I think that there is enough evidence that we do, even if we experience it, we do not agree. And I think that political developments in the US and the success of both big parties in the US explain a lot of what I'm saying.
Thank you. It's really interesting, particularly to hear the kind of questions in response to the overall framing, and then set like this against this kind of longer term story that you're saying. So let me turn to a couple of the questions that are really trying to ask about this very long run, which I think is one of the kind of most striking features of the book. And let me pose you two, because I think they work together. The first is from Felipe Brescancini. I apologize for my pronunciation. And Felipe, who's an alumni of LSE, asks, after hunter-gathering, whether you'd say there's any particular moment in history in which the accumulation of wealth became very predominant, whether there's a kind of a moment after hunter-gathering where things change, I think, in our accumulation, our attitudes to wealth. And the second, which I think comes quite interestingly, and you know, I think either of these would be really interesting to hear about, which asks from Kirsten Potts, asking us about how, as work becomes monetized, how the creation of payment changes the dynamic of work. I think Kirsten really wants to get more of a sense about this shift from domestic, from household, into a more monetized situation.
Yeah. Patrick, do I understand the first question rightly, that it is about accumulation among hunter-gatherers?
I think it's after hunter-gathering. So any moment after hunter-gathering. I think that kind of, I think you made very clear that there's a shock after hunter-gathering where wealth starts to be accumulated, and whether there's a moment after that when accumulation becomes very, very predominant is the term.
Yeah, that is, if we date the agricultural revolution to 12,000 years ago, then what I gather from the literature is that after a few thousand years, and especially in the Middle East, what they call the Fertile Crescent, so that is Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt, that there you see a substantial possibility of surpluses in agriculture. And then let's say the question how to deal with that without having a market. Yeah, and then if I can go then over to markets itself, so that's the emergence of this deep monetization. What it means is, on the one hand, and that is maybe sounds a bit unlikely, but it is in a way a liberation of wage labor, because it means if a wage laborer receives coins instead of food, he or she can decide what to do with the coins. Coins are, in a way, they are neutral, and they leave the freedom to the receiver how to spend the coins. So I think in a way, you can see it as an emancipation of wage labor. Having said that, of course, everything depends on how many coins you get for how much work, etc., etc. But if you contrast remuneration in kind, which mostly means a dwelling from your boss, protection from your boss, food from your boss, it also means complete dependence on your boss, which is, sometimes I explain it to my students as follows. You can compare it to a customer who's been visiting a sex worker. Mostly he will pay in cash. Why? Because he and also she wants to end this relationship after this. So it is that kind of independence I'm talking about.
Okay, this is fascinating and really, really interesting. Obviously, we've got a huge range of different questions. So let me pick. I think probably this might be one of the last ones that we pick. But it's interesting, and it comes back to I think one of the comments that Sara was making. So this is from John Bryant, who's really asking about the work undertaken by the rentier class, who are earning an income with little effort. And as he puts it, as the super rich get richer through the accumulation of capital, how can we improve the rewards for real work? So I think there's two sides to this, right? I mean, how do you deal with the rentier class in thinking like this? Are they working in the way that you're thinking about work? And is there a way given the importance of capital and returns to capital, to address, to deal with the problem that this might be causing for real work?
Well, it's of course again the political question in our society, or in any society we live in, how we think that we should rein in the aggrandizers. That is because, as I said, this is human nature. You want to improve yourself, and you are quite capable of doing this at the cost of somebody else. It is, do your fellow humans, do they allow you, yes or no? And then it is not so important whether the rentier class works or not. We have the classical example, especially in the early modern period, where they did not work. But these days, the multi-billionaires, etc., they work, at least what I read about from them, most of them, they work like hell. It is, but that does not entitle them to this completely crazy relation between effort and remuneration, because there are also a lot of poor people who work like hell. So that does not matter. But it's interesting that the rich people now, especially also as exposed to the media, they work like hell because they think it gains them respect. It does not gain respect if you do not work. I think this is the best proof of what I wanted to say about this other aspect of work. They don't have to, but they do.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It actually touches very much on a couple of final questions about how our views on work actually change how important we find work to be. I mean, that decision among these kind of incredibly wealthy investors with tons of money, as you say, they don't have to work, but nowadays they work where once they would have chosen not to. And I think it's very interesting. A number of people are asking here about how changing views on work have impacted on how important we find work to be. And I suppose that's kind of almost a final question for you. Do you think, to what extent do you think your own views on work and the value it has had in your life inflect your perception of the value of work in the book? Because you clearly love your work.
Unavoidably it does, as it does that I'm an optimist. I can't help it, I can't change myself in this respect, and I should be quite open about that. And so let's hope that a good professional pessimist will write a smashing reaction to my book, and maybe then in between we'll find a nice meeting ground. No, that's just, I think it goes at least for the social sciences, and I think history is part of the social sciences. That's unavoidable. But I hope that in my book, I've maybe not enough, but at least I've shown these conflicting tendencies that we have. And if I may come back to one very important remark by Sara also, that if we engage in collective action, we immediately, but it stems already from our basis in the household, we immediately shape insiders, outsiders. That is the great trap of any collective action, and that's also why trade unions, however important I consider them to be, and I'm quite serious about it, why they always have to guard against it. And you see it in the immigration question, how easily this kind of collective action, these kind of organizations can fall into this trap. Australia, labor history of Australia is an excellent example of it. The whites against the rest, or the white Anglo-Saxons, or the white Protestant Anglo-Saxons, etc., etc., etc. That is because we think group-wise. We don't think we do, but we do, because we have been raised in households. That's the first group. We think as members of a group, and that is we always are inclined to exclude others. And that is also, of course, part of the total human history, because also hunter-gatherers, these small groups, they also were including the members, excluding others. It's also to a way unavoidable, and well, maybe that is maybe one of the main messages. Well, I'm not a great philosopher, let alone a theoretician, but these tensions that we see in our behavior as we have inherited them over the generations. And we have to be aware of it if we think about work as it has developed and as it will develop. And also what Sara underlined, I think rightly so, that history is not predetermined. As I say in my book, in general, we see over the last 150 years that slavery has gone down. Nevertheless, we have seen episodes not too long ago in which slavery was there alive and kicking in Germany, in Russia, in China, and it could happen again. That is so being an optimist, which again I cannot avoid. I'm not blind to these possibilities, and that's the main message of the book. Although I've not put it in that way, that we are aware of all these possibilities if we consider it. And then I think, again, to come back to one point of Sara, that's also the challenge to economics as a science, as a discipline, that we should look much broader than we used to do in this individualistic, market-oriented, with a lot of other presuppositions, and then the game can start. No, the game of history is much wider.
Well, thank you. I'm always on the side of the optimists, I have to say. And we've been members of a very privileged group here this evening to have the chance to hear you present your work and discuss it. So thank you very much, Jan, for a wonderful talk. Thank you, Sara, also for a rigorous and engaging response to it. And thank you to all of our audience here for what's been an amazing array of questions that have provoked, I think, a very, very interesting conversation here about the past, the present, and the future of work. So thank you very much for joining us. You can find more information about the department and our activities on our website. And the next event that we'll be holding will be the Epstein Lecture by Philip Ager on the effect of immigration restrictions on the economy on the 10th of March this year. Philip, this is our lecture for a very prominent, very distinguished junior member of the discipline. So please, I look forward to joining you there. So it just remains for me to say thank you once again to Jan for a fabulous lecture. And thank you and good night.